I was recently watching a video about Bethesda games, and it's a bit old now, but it basically said, Bethesda is talking about making their games more livable, they heard that players like living in their games, blah blah blah, stop that isn't what we as players want. And while watching I was just thinking, no man, shut up, I do want to live in Bethesda games, that's the best part. And then it just hit me like a train. Bethesda has completely misunderstood what players meant when we told them that we enjoyed living in their worlds, and it's ruined their games and destroyed their company. So as a preface, I like Bethesda games, and I was recently indulging myself in some Elder Scrolls as some escapism from a not bad but busy year, a common feeling for fans of Bethesda games. And doing so made me look back a year at the release of Starfield. Despite the negative sentiment online, I liked and still like the game, but I was never able to fully immerse myself in it. Working full-time, I would come home and play for an hour or two, but I felt no desire to binge for several at a time, even on weekends. Being over a year ago now, I've had a lot of time to reflect on that experience, and I still largely attribute that feeling to the lack of interesting exploration potential and the general small feeling scale of the game. Yet when you heard Bethesda talk about the game before release, it was supposed to be the grandest Bethesda game ever, and now a year later, instead of believing it was just fluff and artificial hype, I believe that they believed we would actually think so. And the reason they thought so really goes back to around the release of Skyrim, when we said we like living in Bethesda games. What did we mean by that? Well, we meant we loved living in these worlds for a few days to a week at a time, fully immersing ourselves in it. You barely ate, you barely slept, you barely drank anything, you would just sit and play Bethesda games. Why did we do that, and why did we feel that way? Well, there are a number of reasons. You can go into more detail about it than this, but essentially, it was the sense of scale, the exploration. Hey, what's that over there? Well, let's go check it out. The simple controls also helped. As much as Bethesda combat is mocked for its simplicity, I really think that it's a benefit to the immersion to not be distracted by complex combat mechanics, while still being addicting, not fun necessarily, but addicting enough to keep you playing and immersed in a handcrafted world where the fun instead comes from the exploration and quest storylines. Many types of media can be good enough for this feeling. Good books do this as you read them over the time span of maybe a few days to a week. TV shows, tabletop games, etc. It's not like unique to video games or anything. The point is, what we did not mean was, we want this to be our 9 to 5. I love these procedurally generated quests I can do forever. The content never ends. I can just live in this world the rest of my life when I come home from my real job. That's what I want. And then in Skyrim we had manor building, and now every Bethesda game needs settlement building and shipbuilding and shit. These are new staples of Bethesda games that no one needed. They're nice to have, and I'm not denying the enjoyment people get out of them, but they're not what made these games livable. That wasn't what we meant when we said that. It's difficult to overstate how big of a blunder it is to misinterpret "we like living in these games" from a point about the immersion and exploration of the environment to a point about spending lots of time over the span of years playing a game from copious amounts of procedural content and player content like base building and resource management. Okay, let's talk for the rest of the video about those two things, because the misguided emphasis on them in modern Bethesda games has caused a lot of problems. Something I've learned about procedural content and random generation from implementing it in my own games is that because handcrafted content is almost always better, you need a specific reason to look towards procedural or random generation in the first place. And when you do use it, there are conditions that need to be met for it to have its intended effect. One of the main uses of procedural generation is for the replayability of the combat in different environments. Think of roguelikes and lights. Notice how all of these games have very, very fun core gameplay, combat movement, etc. And notice how while nothing is fully random, of course, much of this type of procedural content is just mashing together pre-made content in specific ways. And the quality of that handcrafted content and how it's mashed together affect the quality of the outcome. For example, in my own boomer shooter, the procedural maps just kind of spread out with a bunch of random rooms and puzzles. It was not fun. The solution was to change the handcrafted rooms to feel more like progressive stages and change the algorithm from spread out like a maze to a linear map with some offshoots. Still though, most importantly is just the focus is on the combat. I'm bringing these examples up and emphasizing the combat to show that while the algorithm Bethesda was so proud of in Skyrim was indeed complex, because Bethesda combat fucking sucks, it isn't what we're playing the games for, and it's not what we meant when we said said this phrase, and Bethesda, proud of their parameterized templates and shit, misinterpreted us. Another main use of procedural generation is replayability of exploration. Think of survival sandbox games like Minecraft, Terraria, whatever, or other exploration-heavy games, RPGs, whatever. Notice how these games always have lots of handcrafted content for you to find when you explore, and that content is combined with generation that is very deep and varied, and the other mechanics in the game give you a reason to explore. Keep that in your head, by the way, we'll bring it back to RPGs in a second. But obviously there's another way to use procedural generation for exploration, which is using it as a starting point and then handcrafting content on top, which is a creative and resourceful way to generate terrain and then have a handcrafted map. Bethesda thought so too, because that's what they used to do and what they still do. They generate terrain and then handcraft content on top of it. And what's crazier is that they had crazy procedural content before that in their oldest games. They moved on from that content because it was boring and only a result of the technology of the time. And then they moved back to it. Why did you do that, Bethesda? Who the fuck would rather explore 10 Gorgillion dusty fucking planets over just five good planets, one solar system? What are you doing? And by the way, I don't know when AI will take over RPGs and gaming in general, and you'll be able to get handcrafted quality with procedural generation. I'm sure the doomsday is upon us when we're all sucked into the fucking Matrix machine with endless AI Elder Scrolls, but until that comes, human-made handcrafted content is better. Procedural generation is a tool and not a selling point. Look what you've done, No Man's Sky. Look what you've done. Okay, you get the point. You need a good reason to use procedural generation. Let's turn our attention to the other aspect of Bethesda games that is meant to get you to live in these games, which is base building and resource management, which I'm lumping together because even though they're different mechanics, they collectively form that, player input sandbox element kind of deal thing. Player creation and resource gathering and management mechanics are obviously great for replayability because you're not replaying a game as much as you are collecting and then using tools to express creativity. So remember when I was talking about reasons to explore? Well, traditional RPGs have a lot of reasons to explore, like exploration while questing, search of loot like gold and gear, and of course just exploration for the sake of it, see the views. What's that over there? I don't know, let's find out. That feeling is what made Bethesda games specifically such a joy to explore, that bouncing exploration feel from one unique place to the next, just for the sake of seeing them. But newer Bethesda games always feel the need to include a resource gathering element to the exploration, and in theory this would give exploring more purpose, but in practice it just waters down the experience. If you're not interested in the thing you're exploring for, in this case getting resources for base building, then you're not going to be interested in the exploring. Not everyone is playing these games to create pseudo art with their ships and bases. I'll spend 5 minutes customizing my base in an RPG, but I'm not playing the game to do that, and I spend as little time as possible with base building in RPGs. I understand a lot of people really enjoy this, and that's great, but these mechanics are meant to be the frosting on top for people that enjoy them to enjoy. I don't like feeling like I'm missing out on a large part of the game for not indulging in it. There's a sweet spot you need to achieve. Tim Willits, yes, the same one from the Quake video, did a great interview with IGN talking about the success of Space Marine 2, the most recent game he was a part of. The whole article is gold and you should check it out, but the important part for this specific video is this section about overscoping games. Quoting the article, Willits believes AAA developers are tending to overscope their games, which in turn means they fail to do any one thing brilliantly. For Space Marine 2, Willits explained, Saber made sure to nail the core combat and keep a handle on the scope of the game. Later on, quote, and then we adhere to our core pillars like to be the ultimate Space Marine, melee, ranged, swarms, that's it. And a lot of teams throughout development will overscope games. They look at some other game that just came out and say, oh, we got to do that, let's add this. And they lose focus on the core, what actually makes the game fun. There isn't some revolutionary new gameplay mechanic that no one's ever seen before. There are gameplay mechanics that people are familiar with, but we do it really, really well. And we execute really, really well. It is so helpful to see developers of highly successful games being cogent about that success. He's totally right about this, and it's something I wish every studio took to heart. RPG games specifically because they're so broad in scope already. And listen, they can have ship, weapon, base, etc. customization and resource collecting, and in fact, I think that when it's done well, it's great because it obviously adds a lot to the role-playing experience when you can customize all these elements of the game. But when you overscope these mechanics to the point that they are diluting from the core experience, you should then realize, okay, there's a problem here. Unless, of course, that resource collecting and extreme customization of weapon base whatever is the core gameplay, and then you're not letting other elements dilute that. Alright, well that about does it. Taking a lesson from old Willits, I narrowed the scope of this video to just be about how Bethesda misinterpreted this common praise of their games. Alright, well goodbye.